It was 1848 when a group of young reformers made a pact to revitalize contemporary art. They called themselves the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, and together they probed the vanguard by reviving the distant past. Their vehement critiques of the modern ethos courted controversy in a notoriously orthodox age, but no one brought the drama quite like Dante Gabriel Rossetti, whose passionate nature made a mess in life, but magic on the canvas. This is Several Circles. The ancient tale of Proserpina is, like Dante Gabriel Rossetti's story, one of temptation and tragedy. Having unwittingly tasted a forbidden pomegranate, the unfortunate goddess was condemned to the underworld for part of every year to come. Her banishment from the land of the living is said to signal winter, and her happy return heralds the beginning of spring. Proserpina is an exemplary Rossettian image, cautionary in theme and sumptuous in execution. Rossetti painted with a sensuality that ruffled the delicate feathers of his Victorian peers, but his lustful temperament informed a uniquely seductive style that defied the stuffy virtues of his day. Born in London in 1828, Rossetti had rebellion in his blood. Both his father and maternal grandfather were Italian exiles. Rossetti and his three siblings, all of whom became writers and poets, were raised with reverence for the classics, the Bible and Goethe, Shakespeare, and Dante. Rossetti would go by Dante, which was his middle name, after the medieval Italian poet, but it was William Blake with whom Rossetti perceived a real soul connection. He was born 9 months to the day after the avant-garde poet and artist's death, and supposedly mused that maybe he was Blake reincarnate. Rossetti indulged his dual devotion to poetry and painting through his studies at the King's College School, Henry Sass's Drawing Academy, and the Antique School at the Royal Academy, after which he sought further tutelage with Ford Madox Brown. Brown's paintings possessed a vitality that resonated with Rossetti, who identified a similar spirit in the work of William Holman Hunt. Of course, The Eve of St. Agnes, Hunt's portrayal of a poem by John Keats, caught Rossetti's eye at a Royal Academy exhibition in 1848, but he was also taken with the way that Hunt synthesized the nostalgia and the romance of medieval imagery with a skilled realism that medieval art itself lacked. Rossetti, Hunt, and Hunt's classmate, John Everett Millais, united over their shared boredom with the Academy's conventions. The idea that Raphael marked the absolute apex of art was a time-worn principle instituted by the Royal Academy's first president, Sir Joshua Reynolds. Nicknamed Sir Sloshua by Rossetti and friends, Reynolds was a dogged proponent of the sloshy, so-called grand manner of painting, a frivolous style dictated by classical poses in idyllic environments after the masters of the High Renaissance, like Raphael. As such, the grand manner emphasized idealism over realism, whereas Rossetti, Hunt, and Millais preferred the righteous pursuit of the truth. So they formed a secret society, which they called the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, tasked with resuscitating artistic purity for the modern age. Their aims were somewhat nebulous, but what they opposed was crystal clear. So by the autumn of 1848, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood expanded into a collective of 7 like-minded creatives: Rossetti's brother, William Michael Rossetti, a writer and critic who served as their secretary; Frederick George Stevens, an occasional painter better known for his art criticism; the sculptor and poet Thomas Woolner; and the painter James Collinson. They would attract a circle of associates too, including several women, such as Rossetti's sister Christina, who was one of the preeminent poets of the Victorian age, the photographer Julia Margaret Cameron, and slightly later, the painter Maurice Bartoli Stillman. But Hunt, Millais, and Rossetti were the nucleus of the group. They endeavored to resurrect the seriousness and sincerity of the late medieval, early Renaissance period, so they looked to Fra Angelico, to Jan van Eyck, and Sandro Botticelli. In other words, those who came before Raphael. The Brotherhood strove to uphold a unified approach to art making that incorporated a striking color palette, a laser focus on symbolism and moral messaging, and above all else, an unwavering commitment to empirical accuracy. They were an impassioned, if imperfect, group of inspired 20-somethings, so their work doesn't always align with their objectives, but they wielded archaic loveliness of spectacular proportions. What a balm for the ills of rapid industrialization, which forced poor laborers from the country into the dankest corners of the cities, and prompted extensive conflict as the burgeoning working class demanded fair representation. It was a disorienting time, but it was also an era of ingenuity and curiosity. Galvanized by the present, the Pre-Raphaelites longed for the days of yore and harbored naive excitement for the future. They enjoyed a successful debut in 1849. Over at the Royal Academy, Millais showed his Keats-inspired Isabella, magnificent in its energy and unsparing detail, and Hunt presented his triumphant Rienzi vowing to obtain justice for the death of his young brother after a book by Edward Bulwer-Lytton. Rossetti made an 11th-hour decision to exhibit his painting at the Unjuried Free exhibition for fear of how it would be received at the Academy. The Girlhood of Mary Virgin, considered his first significant work of art, amplified a biblical scene with vivid color and ubiquitous symbolism, from Mary's purity to Christ's blood and the Holy Spirit. The painting was accompanied by 2 explanatory sonnets, and it was praised for its resplendence, which is more than could be said for Rossetti's subsequent showcase. Awash in virginal white, the angel Gabriel informs Mary that she's to bear the Son of God. But Rossetti's interpretation was wild to Victorian viewers. Traditional depictions of the Annunciation picture Mary at a prayer desk, receiving the news either passively or with palpable honor and an instant willingness to fulfill her holy destiny. Rossetti portrays a more relatable reaction, using his sister Christina as his model. Still in bed, Mary stares blankly at the divine offering as if paralyzed by its gravitas. Then there's the matter of Gabriel's anatomy. In addition to the ripples of his mortal musculature, we're treated to a peek beyond his tunic, which reveals his nudity. It was all just a little too human. Furthermore, the flattened perspective, a nod to medieval and early Netherlandish expressions of space, was received as a grave technical error. It's a perfectly pleasant composition to most 21st century eyes, but the painting was so heavily criticized for its dense symbolism, moral severity, and offensive creative liberties that Rossetti swore he'd never exhibit publicly again. And he wasn't the only Pre-Raphaelite whose work was lambasted. Millet's Christ in the House of His Parents was utterly torn to shreds by Charles Dickens, who put a number of spicy adjectives to use in his review. Ironically, the Brotherhood found notable inspiration in Dickensian concepts, but he was not a fan of their stance on art or beauty. Once their values had circulated by way of their journal, entitled The Germ, Dickens urged the public to just ignore the Pre-Raphaelites, whose work, he said, existed at, quote, the lowest depths of what is mean, odious, repulsive, and revolting. It's a good thing art is subjective because, on the contrary, the Brotherhood earned lasting support from John Ruskin, an influential critic who preached their potential to, quote, lay in our England the foundation of a school of art nobler than the world has seen for 300 years. Rossetti's paintings stand out as the most anomalous of the core Pre-Raphaelite contributions. With reference to his Italian Catholic heritage, he conjured a certain mysticism, but more so, he simply wasn't as technically skilled as his co-founders, and this freed him to be intuitive and to focus on the atmosphere of his paintings. By the 1850s, he began to stray from his own rigid ideals and experiment with art for art's sake, a philosophy that evolved into the aesthetic movement, carried forth by Aubrey Beardsley, James Abbott McNeill Whistler, and Oscar Wilde over in the literary space. We know that for £20, Rossetti purchased a portrait by Botticelli, and he clearly emulated aspects of Botticelli's style in rendering his own ethereal women. Botticelli sacrificed anatomical accuracy where it served to intensify the sublime beauty of his subjects, and the beauty of Rossetti's subjects similarly transcends their physical forms. He was guided by the poet in him, and very much the lover in him, too. In 1850, Rossetti met the young Elizabeth Siddal. She was modeling for Walter Deverell, an associate of the Pre-Raphaelites, when Rossetti was utterly taken with her copper hair and porcelain skin. Well-read and artistically inclined, she was a woman after his own heart. She lent herself not only to Rossetti's art, but to Millet's, for whom she so famously became the broken-hearted Ophelia, an omen of her own demise. Rossetti and Siddal married in 1860, but their pairing proved toxic. Siddal had a taste for an opium tincture known as laudanum, and Rossetti had a taste for other women. One of his mistresses was Fanny Cornforth, a spirited broad whose vivacity radiates through some of Rossetti's luscious portraits, but more complicated was his relationship with Jane Morris, whose iconic features were too alluring for Rossetti to ignore. Rossetti was instantly besotted with Jane when he first laid eyes on her in 1857. They met at a theater in Oxford while Rossetti was fulfilling a commission for the Oxford Union Library. It was a project that he shared with William Morris and Edward Burne-Jones, both second-generation Pre-Raphaelites who, along with John William Waterhouse, carried the Brotherhood's torch after the founding group disbanded in 1854. Rossetti solicited an arresting new model in Jane, who would become his Venus, his Beatrice, and his Pandora in more ways than one. Despite this magnetic attraction, she married William Morris, and Rossetti married Siddal, whom he crushed irreparably with his infidelities. Siddal was already in poor health when she suffered a devastating miscarriage, and in 1862 she overdosed on laudanum at just 32 years old. Siddal's death broke Rossetti. He buried her with his only manuscript of recent poems and painted several versions of Beata Beatrix in her image, a luminous portrait after Beatrice Portinari, the object of the poet Dante's undying affections. In his guilt and grief, Rossetti turned to Jane Morris, who had grown unhappy in her own marriage despite her husband's kindness. Circa 1865, they ignited a precarious affair. They were both in business with William Morris, who established a design firm that, in merging fine art and practical design, laid the groundwork for the arts and crafts movement and, later, Art Nouveau. Morris likely knew about the affair, but he seems to have kept his opinions to himself. Rossetti's adoration for Jane was apparent in the way he painted her, and he called Proserpina, which he created in multiple iterations, his very favorite design. But it belies the screaming agony of both the painter and his muse. It's a static picture of infinite regret, with nothing but a wisp of smoke from her incense burner to denote the passage of time. She clings to happier memories like a tendril of ivy clings to her stone prison, framing a strange light behind her, perhaps the light of home, which she turns away from in sorrow. In the upper right-hand corner is a corresponding sonnet recanting Proserpina's melancholy tale, yielding another of Rossetti's double artworks, which merged image and verse. Rossetti was likewise imprisoned in a hell of his own making. Siddal's untimely death accelerated his descent into mental and physical illness. He became sickly, paranoid, and reclusive, his behavior increasingly erratic. He treated his depression and insomnia with an elixir of whiskey and chloral, a sedative, and he's said to have filled his home with 2 wombats, a llama, and a toucan, which he trained to ride the llama. As his eyesight faded and he doubled down on his poetry, he penned a number of new works, but he became especially fixated on publishing some of his existing poems, like Jenny, an unusually sympathetic narrative about the life and woes of a prostitute. The hitch was that the only copies of his mature verses were buried with his late wife, so he arranged for her to be exhumed. The deed was carried out by a friend of Rossetti's, who reported to the obviously unstable artist that Siddal had miraculously not decomposed, and that her lustrous red hair had continued to grow until her coffin was alight with a copper glow. Rossetti published the volume, but he was tortured by a particularly harsh review that denounced his poetry for being as salacious and quote-unquote fleshy as he was. He subsequently suffered a series of psychotic breaks. In the mid-70s, Jane broke off their affair, but he maintained a loving friend and caretaker in his former lover, Fanny Cornforth. Letters exchanged between the two illustrate a fondness for and comfort with one another. Poking fun at the joys of aging out, he called her his elephant, and he was her rhino. She even worked as his housekeeper for a time, until his family coldly evicted her and stole him away to a seaside village in Kent, where he died, age 54, in 1882. Sadly, Cornforth died penniless and alone in 1909, but it's thanks to her that we're able to enjoy a number of Rossetti's paintings ourselves. She amassed her own Rossetti collection, which she said to have acquired from the artist before she was kicked out of his home. And when she fell on desperate times, she sold it to a Delaware-based textile mill owner, Samuel Bancroft. Today, Bancroft's collection of Pre-Raphaelite artworks, housed at the Delaware Art Museum, constitutes the largest of its kind in the United States. Rossetti's infatuation with female beauty was responsible for such monumental creation and destruction alike, and flawed as he was, he's duly recognized for his role in establishing one of the first distinctly modern cultural crusades. Rossetti's appetite for rule-breaking made space for artists who were also disruptors and advocates, in addition to being the architects of our visual worlds. The Pre-Raphaelites are history, but their dreamy aesthetic echoes well beyond its time and place. Thanks for watching Several Circles. Don't forget to subscribe for more videos about the lives and work of extraordinary artists from across history and the present day, and let us know in the comments if there's an artist you'd like to know more about.